So, the 1990s is called the decade of the brain. And the reason why it's called the decade of the brain is because we learned more about how the brain works and how the brain learns and how the brain is and is not wired during the 1990s. So, what does that mean for us as educators? Well, if you're like me, I actually completed my education training in the 1990s, which means everything I learned about how to teach, I learned before our profession embraced what we learned during the decade of the brain. It kind of makes me in an awkward moment. I had to go back and learn, well, what is it about the brain? What is it that we know? And how can that impact the decisions about instruction and curriculum for me? The second thing that really stands out to me about brain research is that the brain keeps changing. It changes in its development and generationally. So my mother's brain and her development and my son's brain and his development is starting to look really different. And we're getting more and more research about what that is, why that looks different, and how that impacts what we're going to do now in terms of curriculum and instruction. So what I'd like to share with you now is a little bit about what we've learned about that, give you some language about the background on it, and then build the impact on language development and reading for all grade levels. So the first thing that you need to think about when you think about the brain is that there's different areas of the brain. And so if we were going to name those areas just for our discussion here today, if I drew a brain and it looked a little bit like a kidney, okay, and we take a picture of the brain, we can identify certain areas. So there's one area known as Broca's area, and there's another area of the brain known as Wernicke's area. And Broca's area is really dedicated to taking in sound. It takes in sound in large chunks and little chunks. So it hears cat, and then it hears k, a, t. And Broca's area can put together k, a, and t, and put it together and create a sound bundle or a sound chunk, cat. And it never has to see a letter to do that. Broca's area is entirely just auditory. Okay, so we call that auditory processing. Well, the complement to Broca's area is Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is all about symbol recognition, symbols. So this is where concrete images of letters, letter of the week, A, B, C, D, all of those things live in Wernicke's area. But when they're there in Wernicke's area, they're just letters. Okay, so the letter Y. For the brain to get a sound to match with the letter Y, it would need to send a signal from Wernicke's area to Broca's area to say, hey, I got this whole little symbol, squiggly. What sound does it make? And it'll go to Broca's area, and Broca will have all of the sounds of the language categorized. And it will say, oh, that's a Y. It makes the, and then it'll make a sound. So to read or to write, a learner would have to have fluency in the sound area, Broca's area, in order to make letters make sense. So language comes in what we call complementary forms, right? So I have receptive elements of language, okay? And I have generative. So let's break that down. Listening is receptive. Speaking is generative. All right. Reading is receptive and writing is generative. So when I'm working in the language cortex, we'll call this the language cortex of the brain. I'm asking a brain to go back and forth repeatedly between Broca's area and Wernicke's area to make sense of language. If I'm being receptive and I'm listening, but I'm trying to take notes, a student is hearing the chunks of sound into Broca's area and then sending it over to Wernicke's area in order to write down what it is you just said. Similarly, if a student is looking at written text and you say, okay, students, I want you to read what you're looking at, the student has to be able to go into Wernicke's area, identify all those letters, send the information to Broca's area to be able to produce the sounds that go behind those letters. So when we take the brain research and we say, all right, well, what kind of impact does that have on the development of reading or the understanding of writing process in schools? You kind of need to back it up a little bit and look at the changes that we've been witnessing in the brain development between the generations. So, to take that into an example, if you look at my mother's brain, when my mother was a baby, she lived in a nursery that was kind of neutral colored, kind of creams, taupes, grays, real pale pinks, real pale blues. And she didn't have a whole lot of visual stimulation. And so as my mother got older, her Broca's area or her sound development area was fully developed. But she didn't have as much visual stimulation, so her visual cortex was less developed. And so the curriculum in a school that would meet my mother's needs was one that really focused on the letters of the week, maybe, and also a curriculum that was visually based. Show my mother the world. Show her pictures of penguins. Show her pictures of a desert, because she may not have actually seen them, but she already had fluency in all 44 sounds of the English language, thanks to Broca's area. Now, fast forward. If you get to my son. Now, my son lives in a household where we all speak fluently. We read to him constantly. And so we are absolutely supporting his language development. But the truth about brain research is that there's only so much mitochondria to go around. And if given a choice between developing the sound system or the visual system, it seems to be that the brain favors visual development. So given that choice, the visual cortex is going to trump sound development. So my son, when he went to school, absolutely had an underdeveloped Broca's area and a hyper-developed visual cortex. In fact, we haven't seen visual cortexes this developed in school-age children ever. I don't even know what superpowers these children are going to have in terms of their visual cortexes. But I can tell you that when we've been assessing high school students, high-performing high school students, they can fluently distinguish consistently only 36 on average, 36 of the 44 sounds of the English language. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Broca's area in children like my son is not fluent and not as developed. So what kind of curriculum would I need to have for these students? Well, I don't need a visually based curriculum. No more letter of the week. What I need is sound of the week. I need to actually overtly teach and assess the sound system, the 44 sounds of the English language. Don't worry about the 26 letters. They got it. They got it quick. How many kindergartners do you know that when they come in, they absolutely can name all the letters? Oh yeah, they got that. But if I say, name the 44 sounds of the English language, how many people are going to be successful? It's not the common part of the curriculum that we're used to having to teach because we never had to before. But now we're running into situations where more and more students like my son would end up being recommended to go into speech support. They wouldn't be getting recommended to go into speech therapy because they seem to not be connecting the sounds, all right? Or we're worried about their hearing, okay? And so what the truth is here is my son, when he went to school, he had seen a picture of a penguin, thousands of them, most of them dancing. But what he didn't have was fluency in the language. So he doesn't need that development. What he needs is someone to sit there and overtly teach and assess the sounds. The brain has 6.4 nanoseconds to go from receptive or receiving the information, either as an auditory chunk or as a visual piece. Receiving the information, they have 6.4 nanoseconds to transfer that information into comprehension. I'm going to talk about that in another video. But the idea here is if I slow down, if any part of Broca's area or Wernicke's area is slow, that eats up that time. And so what will happen is the child will not be able to understand either what they are hearing or what they are reading. So let's take this now into, so what do we do about it? What we're finding is that with students, when we're teaching them how to read, the first step is the sound system. So this is why schools such as Finland, and if you want to learn more about Finland, you can watch the documentary on the Finland phenomena. They actually have an auditory curriculum all the way up through age 7. No letters, no numbers, strictly auditory sound processing curriculum. The second piece we need to think about is how many of our programs, curricular programs that I can buy off the shelf, almost, actually I got to tell you, almost 100% of them have visual-based foundations. Okay, so even if they're a program like the Wilson program, which is a sound-based system, but they'll have cards with pictures on them and the letters and letters with different colors. If I write the word cat and I make the A a different color, then already I have taken the brain and gone first into Wernicke's area. Then I sent it to the visual cortex, and then I sent it to Broca's area. Remember, I said you had 6.4 nanoseconds. So I can't send the brain on these journeys. I just slowed down the reading process just by doing that. Many of our curriculums put pictures in or do these kinds of visual techniques almost out of habit. Remember, that's what my mother's brain needed, not my son's. So a curriculum that I can buy off the shelf, it's not really encouraged to be a sound-based curriculum because there's no pictures and there's no letters. What exactly did you buy? Auditory curriculum choices are going to be ones where we're doing a lot of the speaking. And again, animated characters don't form the letters correctly. So when I'm going through the vowel swing and I go E, E, A, almost 50% of my high school students misidentify that sound, ah. They say it's an A. They can't hear and distinguish that it's the short O. That kind of lack of fluency in the sound system impacts spelling, reading, and comprehension. I'm going to talk about that more when we go forward. But the curriculum choices that we need to do are going to focus in on developing the sound system. And this kind of intervention can happen, I really see it as a kindergarten, right? Early, all the way up through grade 5. But in middle school, I can use it as an intervention. Do I have a student who's making the same kind of spelling errors all the time? Maybe it's between twin pairs. Neurologically, when I'm laying down the sound system, I want to start in the front of the mouth. If you drew a homunculus of the brain, it would show that the mouth and the hand are the two strongest ways to learn. So when you're building a neurological pathway, starting in the front of the mouth with a p and b sound. Okay, that's a twin pair, p and b. When a student is actually working through that, if they're going to make a spelling error and they're not hearing the sound correctly, they're going to mix up a P and a B. The second, T and D. Go ahead and make these sounds. You're private. You're watching a video. So in the middle of the mouth, right? T, D. Don't put the vowel on. Don't go T, da, okay? It's T, D. That's in the middle. Your tongue is, it's called a tongue stopper. It's in the middle of your mouth. Neurologically, you just moved further back in the sound system in Broca's area. Now go K, G. This is in the back of the throat. That's another twin pair, K, K, and J, G. Now, these are sounds. It's actually very important to teach the brain that letters don't make sounds. When I do that, then it makes me think that that letter is what always produces that sound. But there's only 26 letters and there's 44 sounds. If we do the math, it's actually stronger to teach the brain, especially my son's brain, that there are sounds. and I can show sounds by using letters. If I do that, then I stop a lot of the misunderstandings that happen between sounds and letters. So, for example, the letter Y. We often teach children, if I use a visually based curriculum, we teach children that the Y makes the Y sound. Let's think about that for a second. When does it do that? Okay, yellow and yak and yo-yo. Yeah. These are all the pictures, right, we use in a visual curriculum. Why? But the truth of the matter is, Y only makes that sound when it's at the beginning of a word, and that's the only time that it is acting as a consonant. At all other times in the language, whenever a Y is located anywhere else in the word, it makes a completely different sound, and it never makes the Y sound. So, unless the child was fluent in all 44 sounds and could make that transition in what we call unconscious competence, we just ruined their ability to decode that Y when they see it in a word. Now, the visual cortex is going to pick that up just fine. The visual cortex is going to be very happy with that Y. But Broca's area is going to be very confused. And remember, I said 6.4 nanoseconds. So if they have to sit there and decode and run through the Y sound every time they see a Y before they actually find that most of the time it makes an I or an E or an E sound, then we've slowed down a student's reading again. English as a language actually has 4 layers to it. So the first layer of the English language is Anglo-Saxon. An Anglo-Saxon layer of the language is a wonderful layer because it really works with closed syllables and open syllables. And when I'm decoding, it's all about what happens to that vowel sound. Okay, and there's 19 vowel sounds. So what happens to that vowel sound based on the letters around it? And I can set up rules and decoding structures that make sense with these open and closed syllables. And any child decoding, so words like cat, right, or apple, I can work through these things and I can find out that the letters are working for me according to the rules. But what happens is the Anglo-Saxon layer of the language starts changing somewhere around 3rd grade. Okay, so when 3rd grade comes in, now I'm starting to get in the Latin layer of the language. The Latin layer of the language really sets up prefix, and then I've got a root, and then I've got a suffix. Okay, so now take that Y we were talking about earlier, which back in the day for yellow made a Y sound. But now if I'm working with a word like lovely, and it's an ly at the end, that's actually Latin based. Lovely, the ly has meaning to it. It tells me that I'm operating with an adverb. And that Y now makes an E sound, never touches a Y. Okay? And so now the student has to sit there and, to decode these things, I need to understand these other bits of language. So prefixes, roots, and suffixes. So very quickly after 3rd grade, 4th grade and 5th grade start entering curricularly into the Greek layer of the language. The Greek layer of the language goes root, root, root. Okay, no prefix, no suffix, no open syllable, closed syllables, root, root, root. And each root has meaning. And what it starts doing is compounding these roots into meaning chunks. So Broca's area has to take the entire sound in as a whole and make it to comprehension. To do this, the student has to be fluent in both the sound and the letter system of the language. Very strong to get to comprehension. So the Greek layer of the language is where we tend to lose our readers, which is why in many cases we start seeing a huge drop-off in comprehension and functionality at the 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade layer of education. And so what happens is, for people like my mother, when my mother went to school, going back to our example, my mother's brain, for her to build comprehension, all she had to do was read more and more and more. Comprehension happened. We'll talk about that in another video. But for my son, if he doesn't have a complete sound system, when he hits that Greek layer of the language, he can reread it and reread it as many times as I could possibly want. Comprehension will not follow. And what we end up with is with students who read a sentence and go, because it took more than 6.4 nanoseconds for them to make it through it, they read it, and at the end, they have no idea what they just read. And they have to read it again. And they have to get it off the page, but they can never hit the fluency speed to get the comprehension to work. And they get exhausted and fatigued, and they embrace the idea that they're just not good at reading. It's exhausting. They don't like it. This is where I end up with high school students who say they fall asleep trying to read. And I sit there and go, yeah, because your brain's working overtime to try and make it through the Greek layer of the language. The last layer of the language is the French layer, which is why so many people have trouble spelling champagne. And what happens is when the French layer of the language comes in, letters that we used to obey, right? Letters had certain sounds. Yeah, that's not true with champagne anymore, right? Champagne. So what happens is, unless we're fluent in the sound system and we can adjust for the 44 sounds, French layer of the language, suddenly teachers start saying things like, oh, well, that's just a weird word, or, oh, we just accept that, or, I don't know why there's a U in build. Doesn't seem to make any sense. And we sit there and go, well, those are monkisms. There's absolutely reasons why those things have happened. But unless the teachers are comfortable with the language and the sounds, and the students are comfortable with the language and the sounds, then fluency in reading is going to be evasive. And unless students can become fluent just by doing it a lot, which would require a completely solid sound system, then they are not going to be strong readers, and they're going to struggle with spelling. I've actually had teachers say to me, oh, English is such a weird language. Actually, it has a lot of 100% rules, and every layer of it makes perfect sense. Latin is an amazingly well put together language. So is Greek. So the truth is, they're not comfortable then with those 4 completely different layers of our language, and explaining to students that sometimes the W is a vowel, and sometimes that S isn't operating as anything but a morpheme telling you it's plural. Or sometimes that E is a vowel, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's just holding up that part of the letter, that part of the word, so that the meaning is consistent. These are the things that come out when we get comfortable with the different layers of the language. But let's run through one. Let's look at the word, well, B-O-W. And I just want you in your mind to read it. When you read the word B-O-W, what sound do you make? And now what I'd like you to do is take that W and now make it a vowel. Make sure that that O gets the long sound. What's the word now? If you were able to transition that W from being a consonant to being a vowel, fantastic. You have what we call either conscious or unconscious fluency in the sound system where it comes to these particular sounds. If you weren't, we can help you out and we'll give you a visual. Once you have the visual, was your brain able to access and feel comfortable with another way of reading that word? If it was, that means your visual cortex is solid as a rock. But what we really want to start playing with is how can we connect your Broca's area or the sound system and your visual cortex so that there's a what we call neurological superhighway there, and you're fluent between the two. You don't want too much information about language to be stuck in your visual cortex and not be accessible to the other areas of your brain. This is what is going to impact reading. This is what's going to impact comprehension. So we'd like to go deeper into that in our next video.